Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be doing a video that's about a topic that's been on my mind and one that I don't necessarily see a lot of people talking about. I know that there's a lot of new players into the game and one of their first big questions is how do I go about deck building? And well, the big answer to that is depending on the type of deck that you want, you generally have a particular formula or setup or layout or type of card design that you're looking at. So that's going to be the biggest and most daunting thing when approaching the game is just where do you start. So hopefully this is a good video to help figure out where you're going to start. So when it comes to deck building in Digimon, we have three main different styles of decks that we want to incorporate. The last one on this list labeled unique is just an all-encompassing term. That's just basically the other in case something isn't necessarily categorized by the other three types. But we do have traditional stack-based decks, we have Tamer-based decks, and we have hard play-based decks. So each one of these decks has their own sets of pros and cons, and general card pool that they want to look at, and deck design that they're trying to incorporate. So, going over the first one, which is traditional stack-based decks. So, traditional stack-based decks are decks that want to go from egg to level 6 or 7 to try to create the most powerful Digimon that they possibly can and try to win off of the back of that one Digimon. So these decks are generally really good on tempo because they want to follow a nice slope curve in terms of the deck design, so that way they could see the desired cards when they need to, on top of the fact that evolving does usually cost a little bit less than hard playing specific cards, so you're generally gaining some good advantage on top of just being able to draw for every time you're evolving versus some of the other decks. The only downside to this is the fact that these decks tend to have lower flexibility because you usually want to build these decks with a specific stack in mind. Usually the types of abilities you put into the deck, you usually have a sub-stack that you want to try to go for in case you can't necessarily find the parts and pieces to your main one, but most of the time those substacks aren't necessarily what you're trying to gain and don't necessarily always help out what the deck is trying to do, but they're just there so that way you have a plan B in case you can't get to plan A. And that leads into the biggest thing is these decks tend to brick when they don't see their evolution line. So if you don't see your rookies, you're usually in a pretty bad spot, or if you do see your rookies and you can't see your level 4 to go into your level 5, but you have your level 5, then again, you're still put into a bad spot and you need to find ways to be able to help the deck's overall consistency to try to unbrick itself, so that way you could try to have the deck flow as best as it possibly can. So just as an example of a stack-based deck, I'm just going to be utilizing Metal Garurumon because it's a pretty easy one to follow, just because we could see in its level distribution, we have this nice slope curve that we could follow in terms of the quantity of cards that it's putting in, and we also have a nice breakdown of the Digimon to Tamer to option ratio, so that way we also get a general idea on how these decks generally like to flow and function. Then the next deck type that we have are going to be Tamer-based decks. So the goal of Tamer-based decks is to try to outvalue the opponent with just a field of Tamers, utilizing all of their passive abilities to try to gain you extra resources, versus just the opponent trying to digivolve up the chain and try to do various things with their main stack. Then usually these decks tend to run a high amount of Tamers as a result because, you know, that is the core theme and whole purpose of the Tamers, and they're going to usually run a lot of Digimon that can evolve off of Tamers or get played with Tamers, or just wants to utilize Tamers in general, so that way you could try to optimize the fact that you're playing Tamers to begin with. These decks have a pretty decent amount of flexibility when it comes to stack building because you don't really have a stack in mind. You're just going to be trying to go from Tamer or Digimon off of Tamer into whatever you feel like the deck is trying to do, so that way you could set up your win condition. Then these decks tend to only break if you don't necessarily see your Tamers or the Digimon that you want to utilize with your Tamers. So a good example of this is going to be something like Yellow Hybrids. We could see that it has a really high Tamer count compared to the other more traditional stack-based deck, and we could see a consolidation in terms of the level of Digimon it's playing with, and it's working more off of a bell curve just because the concentration of cards that it's trying to utilize is mostly in its level 3s, 4s, and 5s. And then the last style of deck is going to be the hard play decks. So the hard play decks basically are the decks that just want to hard play cards to get value for the cards as is. So these decks aren't necessarily going to evolve very much, if ever at all. And they're usually just going to run lots of various other tamers and options to help flesh out and round out the deck, on top of either really high-costed, high-impactful Digimon, or low-costed, low-impactful Digimon, so that way they could just try to gain value off of the cards as is. These decks are pretty highly flexible in terms of the overall build, because you just don't need to worry about evolution at all. You don't need to worry about specific setups at all. You're just basically just trying to hard play the card and gain the value for what the card is trying to do. Then these decks only tend to break it when you stop seeing enough draw power, which is the big downside. Because you're hard playing a lot of the cards, you're mostly going only 1 for 1. You draw a card at the beginning of your turn, you hard play the card, and you use the card up, so you're not necessarily gaining any cards, and once you run out of steam, then it's very hard for you to come back if your security isn't necessarily good enough, or some of the other cards aren't helping with the deck's overall consistency. So in terms of the decks that this kind of covers, these are your more like security control decks, these are your more rookie rush style decks, and these are just decks like a Dorbigmon OTK, where you're just hard slamming the card to try to gain as much value and impact off of that card as is, with a particular setup and utilizing some of your other cards to try to help get you into your desired board states. But the majority of Digimon decks are traditional stack-based decks, and traditional stack-based decks have gone through lots of different design changes over the course of the game as the game evolved, more so compared to some of the other decks. So just as a couple examples, there's not enough room in traditional stack-based decks for the level 4 blockers that were really good generic filler tools, just because decks started seeing more specific support cards. Then different metas also changed the different types of tools that are viable. So this is like your tech cards, your anti-meta floodgates, the different types of options and removals that you're looking at. So there's just still a lot of change and growth in the game, all depending on the meta environment that we're up against. Then cards work under different power ceilings. So not all power ceilings were made equal, so cards from the very beginning of the game sometimes might not be as good as cards from the middle or later parts of the game in its current state. And then different core mechanics for each of the different decks do influence how each of the different decks are played and designed. So we see DNA decks that want to do something different than X antibody decks, and X antibody decks are going to be doing something different than some of the older style traditional evolution that's not utilizing a specific mechanic to be able to evolve alternatively. So each of the different approaches and different mechanics do influence how the decks are also designed. But when making your decks, you should understand some key and core concepts as Digimon grows and changes, and this should help understand how and why things are changing, and how and what you can do to adapt your deck to those changes. So the three major factors that influence a lot of the changes that go into the decks are going to be their overall power, what protections they have, and how consistent is the deck. So starting off with the first one, power. So power basically just I equates to the damage potential of a deck. So a lot of the newer decks do have a higher damage potential compared to some of the older decks. So that also goes and influences what cards are viable in the specific types of environments. So if you're trying to win the game, usually right now the only real win condition we have is breaking all of the opponent's security. So decks that only can break 1 to 2 security off of their main turn are put at a huge disadvantage compared to decks that have a higher overall damage output that could deal 2 to 4 security during their big power turn. And then if you know that your opponent is playing a deck that has less of a power output than yours, then that only just gives you more time to be able to respond, react, and ultimately counter what the opponent is trying to do. Then decks that don't have good enough damage output still can win, depending on the win condition of the deck and to the skill level of the pilots. And then as far as the second point, when it comes to protection, this kind of just refers to the safe plays that a deck is allowed to make. So not every deck has the same levels of protection. In fact, each of the different style of decks have their own levels of safe play based on the types of mechanics that they're trying to be playing around with. So traditional stack-based decks generally like to hide Digimon in raising, just because effects that can't target a Digimon in raising, on top of them usually having some different types of protections when utilizing some of their higher levels against specific type of abilities like deletion, bounce, tuck, battle, etc. Then Tamer-based decks, generally their safe plays come from the use of their Tamers themselves. So Tamers are still a relatively hard card type to be able to interact with, and not a lot of decks can interact with it, making them relatively safe. So just the act of playing your Tamer, buying your time, setting up your stuff, basically depending on the style of Tamer-based deck that you're using, is just a relatively safe and easy play to do, and a lot of the cards interacting with Tamers could just use the Tamer as a source of evolution, so that way you don't necessarily need to just sit on a level 3 on the field in order to evolve a Digimon on the field to be able to use it right away with, or even if you just play a Tamer, sometimes those Tamers will be able to play Digimon, and then you don't necessarily care if that Digimon lives or dies, because sometimes they might go underneath your Tamer, or you already gained the value and benefit from that card. Then when it comes to hard play decks, that kind of sentiment is in the same style of vein. Why hard play decks don't necessarily have a lot of generic protections themselves is because they don't necessarily care what happens to the card after they use it, because, well, they already used the card. You play a Digimon with a really powerful on-play effect, and, well, you already got the value of that on-play effect, and the body just sitting there on the field is just the icing on the cake for that style of ability. So each of the different styles of decks generally do have their own levels of safe play, and understanding what those safe plays are only will help you not only as a player playing your deck, but the types of cards that you want to include when building your deck. And then the last big point in terms of understanding a core concept as far as how the game functions is consistency. So this is a key fundamental to any card game, not just exclusively to Digimon, as you want to try to make your deck as consistent as possible, so that way the more consistent your deck is, the more it's going to function as intended, and you can make it your more intended plays and have your cards be as effective as they possibly can be. So consistency in Digimon comes down in 3 major forms, which is going to be digging, drawing, and recursion. So digging is just the ability to just look at the top X cards of a specific area that you want and be able to grab cards from them of a specific type, so that way you're just looking for that type of card, so you could use it for whatever its intended purpose is. So searching and digging generally comes out of the deck or the security, pending the deck that you're trying to use, and making sure that you have the ability to be able to grab what you need is super valuable in terms of helping with the deck's overall consistency. Then drawing is another form of consistency. It's the most simplest form of consistency because it is as easy as it sounds, where you're literally just drawing cards from your deck. The more cards you draw, the higher the chances you'll see the cards that you want and need, so drawing is just always good. Then in terms of the last one, this is recursion, which is the ability to reuse your cards or grab them back from your trash or security or under Digimon to be able to use them over and over again, which is another form of consistency, because if you use a card, it goes into your trash. Well, if you have the ability to go into your trash and grab that card back when you need it, well, that's just another factor that adds it to the consistency of the deck. The same could be said for cards in your security and under your Digimon as well, as I already mentioned before, because any way to be able to reuse your cards, whether it's shoving them back into your deck, putting them in your hand, or even just getting them somehow back out on the field, is just super valuable in terms of the ways that we have to reuse our cards to make the deck function as intended. But like I said, for the most part, there are those three major different types of deck styles that are in the game of Digimon. I don't necessarily know if Digimon is going to expand past those three, but the three that we have still offers a lot of different deck diversity and variety in terms of what you want to build and how you're going to build it. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.